Kaisho, hello, hola. I'm very excited to be here. I'm particularly happy today. In the Commons, we often say that we follow the footsteps of giants in the open culture movement because there's many precedents. And in this sense, in this morning, I think we've had three wonderful speakers, and they've done a lot of the heavy lifting for me because they've spoken about some of the things that I'll be talking about. So as I talk, you'll identify some redundancies, but I think that's okay. That's a good way of learning, presenting similar, hopeful ideas in different ways. So what I'm going to present to you today are distributed cooperative organizations. And what these are, they're a set of tools and practices for people to work together in feminist, economic, cooperative, and commons-oriented way. And they're also a reaction, an alternative to something which you may or may not be familiar with, which are called decentralized autonomous organizations. And more in general, we're going to talk about the role of technology and the future of work. Now, this is a conversation that you keep seeing, technology and the future of work. And the answer, which has become quite standard, is automation. We'll have automation, we'll have more leisure time, but then we will have technological unemployment, but then we will have a basic income so you can buy more things from Amazon and get them delivered on a drone. That is one vision. And this conversation seems to allude to the peak of modernity, of where we're going in the future. But in fact, it's a very old conversation. In 1850, Marx was talking about the inevitable next stage when the efficiencies of production would be so high that there would be a revolution leading to a classless, stateless society. In the 1830s, Keynes was talking about increased efficiencies leading to a 15-hour work week. And now we see that things haven't really turned out that way. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. Technology is not neutral. Technology advances certain interests which are embedded in the design of these technologies. And among some of the most salient and disruptive technologies that we have nowadays is the blockchain. So how many of you have you heard of the blockchain? Okay, so lots of people. How many of you feel that you understand the blockchain? Okay, fewer. Of those few privileged ones that understand the blockchain, how many of you do you think that it can be simply explained to people that may benefit from it? So there you are. I will attempt a simple explanation, but this short participatory action research exercise will show you that it's very exclusionary. And in fact, as Mario said, just like in the open source community, most people developing blockchain are white males with a programming and technical background. And the blockchain is being proclaimed as a liberatory technology, and people are being induced to invest in it, both their time, effort, and of course money, without really understanding what's going on. So blockchain, very basically put, is a distributed uncorruptible ledger. Now, ledgers are very important, and it can be argued that the transition from feudalism to capitalism was prototyped in Venice with the invention of double-entry bookkeeping. So that gave us capitalism. So there's a lot of talk in the blockchain space that blockchains may allow us to decentralize everything and to create new value systems. But we think that there's certain biases in the programming of these technologies and value systems which merit a closer examination. So Bitcoin created in 2009, two things happened in 2009. Elinor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize, what? And Bitcoin was created, okay? That's quite curious. So Bitcoin is a great proof of concept. It shows us that we can create a sovereign post-Westphalian currency, but it has many problems. It has a Gini coefficient of inequality that's higher than most fiat currencies, and the power consumption of the Bitcoin blockchain has topped that of Ireland and Denmark, etc. Another development in the blockchain space in 2013, 2014 was smart contracts. And these are little bits of code on top of the blockchain that allow you to have contracts that can execute themselves. And this led to the creation of this artifact called the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, or Corporation. So what these are is organizations that are programmed on this distributed database. And they can levy penalties, they can enforce contracts, they can make payments, And the important thing over here is that they're decentralized and autonomous. They're decentralized, meaning that they do not exist in one single server. They cannot be taken down. And they're autonomous in the fact that they can make payments. You can program them. And this has been proclaimed as a great movement for decentralization. And this is something that I'm very critical of, because when you talk about decentralization through just technological means, but you're not talking about decentralizing power, you're not questioning the patriarchy, you're not questioning capitalist accumulatory dynamics, to me that's not real decentralization as such. Another thing about this is, imagine, so for example, with the Internet of Things, so you deploy one of these decentralized autonomous organizations, your state agent, the person that's renting your house, and because it executes automatically what's being programmed, imagine that you're late with your rent. Well, this organization can issue an order to your smart lock in your house to not let you in, effectively evicting you, or maybe playing loud music over the sound system. If we take this down Mario was talking about sci-fi, the dystopian path, imagine a totalitarian government. Imagine a system that exists in various servers that cannot be taken down. It's like a hydra. You cut off one head of the snake, another heads come up. This, when combined with machine learning and artificial intelligence, you know who's investing in these things, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and blockchains. The same corporate interests that are giving us so much trouble. So what can we expect from decentralized autonomous organizations if we don't have certain ethical and critical codes, and maybe a vision coming more from the political economy side of things than just merely the technocratic? So with the worst case scenario would be something like Skynet. You know what Skynet is? It's the supercomputer that destroys the world in the Terminator films. So, I mean, I'm being, shocking on purpose just to highlight some of the dangers that these technologies may pose, while they also pose some very interesting things. So, DISCOs are a cooperative, feminist, and commons-oriented reaction to decentralized or autonomous organizations. But of course, DCOs, DICOs, it doesn't sound as cool as DAOs. It's so boring, so we came up with, hey, DISCO. It sounds better. So the DISCO DNA, like I say, it's a framework and it's a set of tools. It combines 4 elements. And these elements are peer-to-peer and the commons. They are open cooperativism, the feminist economics, and the contributive accounting. And again, for a movement that talks so much about decentralization, these are strangely absent from the blockchain space. Yes, they talk about P2P, but it's a very technocratic understanding of P2P. And there's some elements of open value or contributory accounting, but it's merely based on the quantitative, on the tokenistic. And also notice that sometimes these movements do not necessarily talk to each other. Maya has highlighted this in her presentation. In the commons P2P world, we need a lot more feminism. So in open value accounting, cooperativism can benefit from the commons, as I'll argue soon, etc. So the DISCO is a framework that unites all this into a hopefully coherent narrative. Little recap on the commons. David has done the heavy lifting. But commons are living systems for people to meet shared needs. And they incite conversations between the past, the present, and the future, between the human and the non-human world, and between groups, small and big. And as has been said, there is no commons without commoning. Commons is best understood as a verb, not a noun. But the commons requires 3 things. It's like 3 legs of a stool. If you take away one leg, you're going to fall. So the first thing would be a resource. And there's an artificial distinction. People talk about immaterial, material commons, but we don't think that's legit, because all immaterial commons, you're creating your great open source software, but you have a body that has to be fed and be taken care of. And by the same token, ideas are not born in isolation, and materiality also needs ideas. So these resources, it's kind of like the locus where commons is focused, but resources can be exploited by the state, can be exploited by the market. A resource is not a commons until we have a community that gathers around this resource. And communities can take many shapes. We're a community of a sort in this room. Your local food co-op can be a community, or maybe you're an editor in Wikipedia, and that's another kind of community. And the third element is the rules that tie the community together. So we have resource, community, and rules, or the what, the who, and the how of the commons. And there's abundant examples: cooperatively run forest, community-supported agriculture, the maker movement, community currencies. Complementary to the commons, but not the same thing, is peer-to-peer. There's people that use commons and P2P interchangeably. To me, they're not the same. P2P is sometimes understood as systems for file sharing, but again, between these servers that can share information in permissionless ways, there's usually people, with bodies to feed and emotions to take care of. Peer-to-peer, to me, has more to do with what we call commons-based peer production, which are these large-scale systems for collaboration, where anyone can collaborate and where validation is done post hoc. Commons are not permissionless. They're usually bounded. They have more specificity, more shape. They're usually smaller in scale. But P2P and the commons can work quite well, because P2P can be an enabler for the act of commoning, for many small acts of commoning within a framework. So these are actually the slides that I sent you the other day, not the last ones, but it's okay. So from the commons, we go to cooperatives, and you can see that there's a lineage. When cooperatives are constituted in the 1840s, the Rochdale pioneers in the UK, these are a reaction to the enclosures of the commons. These are a reaction to the poor laws. And really, we've had cooperatives since we had the modern state or the corporation. And they're very interesting because they overturn the three main tenets of capitalism, meaning private ownership of the means of production becomes collective ownership of the means of production. The employment of wage labor becomes worker owners. And finally, an orientation exclusively towards profit is tempered by the 7 cooperative principles, with a focus more on cooperation and in other outcomes away from absentee profit maximization. Not all co-ops are created equal, and after 180 years, co-ops have not been the mechanism through which a great economic revolution has happened. Marx called them a dwarfish form. Still, so some of the problems, just to enumerate them, sometimes getting a managerial class that comes from capitalism with those values, a lack in cooperative education, and in the worst of cases, demutualization. I'm here in Bilbao, which is the capital of the world, according from people of Bilbao. You're very aware of both the benefits and the shortcomings of co-ops. So in reaction to that, 2 movements arose. The first of those were platform cooperativism. You've heard of platform co-ops, yeah? So platform co-ops aim to democratize the ownership and control of those platforms that increasingly regulate our daily lives. So you can think like, oh, what if Airbnb, instead of being owned and being in service to its investors, was owned by like all the homeowners and all the collaborators? Then it would be a co-op. So we have Airbnb. For every big unicorn, we actually have a small case platform co-op alternative. Open cooperativism arose at the same time, around 2014, but posing a different question, which is, what if we mix the logics of the commons and the open source movement with the rich tradition of the cooperative movement and the social solidarity economy? And open co-ops is based on 4 non-prescriptive patterns, which actually form the base of Disco too. So the next 4 things that I'm going to talk about briefly apply to open co-ops, but also in a bigger sense to Disco. So this first pattern is that in their bylaws, they're oriented toward the common good, or if you don't like that term because it's very Christian, towards social and environmental outcomes. You may have a great platform co-op, or you may, for example, there's a cooperative in Scotland that creates missile guidance systems for defense contractors. So, just having a co-op is not good enough. You want to make sure that what you're doing with your productive capacity is actually beneficial for people and planet. The second thing is that they're multi-stakeholder in nature. This means enfranchising everyone in the value chain and that is affected by the co-op's decision. One value that we readily recognize is, that which is produced by productive labor. But what about reproductive labor? What about care work? What about all the stuff that gets invisibilized but actually makes the productive stuff happen? Good examples of this are the social care cooperatives in Emilia-Romagna and Quebec, where you have 4 types of stakeholder or constituents. So for example, imagine that instead of privatizing the health systems, we give them over to a co-op, okay? So who's going to make the decisions here? Well, in Italy, what they have is 25% of the vote is by the state. The state is putting the money. 25% is by the doctors. But another 25% is by the patients. And the last 25% is by the family members of the patients. So you can see how democracy over here gets projected beyond the membrane of the co-op, because co-ops care for their own membership, but their own membership is not the whole community that we're trying to enfranchise over here. The third pattern is that they actively co-create commons. They don't just enclose their commons. They don't just take from the commons by investing like IBM and open source software to then do the paid services and use the software for dubious purposes. But through pro bono work, they create new commons. And the low-hanging fruit of this can be documentation. What are your best practices? What worked? What were your worst practices that didn't work? Please tell us about it. But also you can share productive infrastructures. You can create fab labs. You can create spaces. You can create places and online depositories for you to share designs, etc. You create commons, which in fact decommodifies some certain activities that you may need for your own life. And the last principle of open co-ops is that they're locally embedded but globally oriented. And this is important because localism and being grounded in place is essential to contrast the systems that are affecting us today, but it's not enough. So say that I have this community permaculture garden, and it's great, but because the legislation in the country that I live in allows for GMOs, my neighbor has planted Monsanto Terminator seeds, and then the wind blows them over into my garden, and now I'm infected. And as we've seen, maybe I get a lawsuit from Monsanto. So the global context is important, and we cannot be isolated islands. And one way that we can mutualize, that we can be globally oriented, again, it's by sharing information and by sharing new flows of value. So after all the theoretical blah, 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 it's like, hooray, here's some humans. Here are 4 examples of open co-ops. And the last one is Guerrilla Translation, which I am part of. And in conversations that we had, we really liked the framework of open cooperativism, but we felt that something was missing. So we decided to take stock of 2 other factors, which are open value accounting and feminist economics. So with that, we have 3 other patterns. So that brings us up to 7, which is a good thing because you have 7 cooperative principles. So now we have like the 7 disco patterns. So these are that. Now, let me just say this. Kind of like a continuity from commons to co-ops, to platform co-ops, to open co-ops, to discos. I know it's a lot of terminology, but there's a thread over here. So things which are germane to distributed cooperative organizations. They're centered on care work. Care and life is at the center of things. And we distinguish 2 types of care work. One of them is the one that you would expect, is how we care for each other within these collectives. The processes, the conversations we have, all those dimensions which are often invisibilized, all that tacit knowledge is brought to the front. But that's only one aspect, because we also consider care work caring for the entity, caring for the cooperative. Unlike the evil robots of the decentralized autonomous organizations, in a disco, we see the entity, the cooperative, as something to be taken care of and nourished. And that's actually part of the technological part of the algorithm. If you're familiar with community land trusts are a legal mechanism to encode certain values for many generations. what we do with discos is we encode those values into the algorithm to make sure that the care work is always brought to the front for the humans within the co-op, but also for the ideals of the cooperative entity. They also include new origins and flows of value. And concretely, discos track 3 types of value. One of them is what we call love work, and this is the creation of commons, usually through pro bono work. So for example, you're a lawyer, so you do some stuff pro bono for social causes, and you do all the stuff paid. So that's what we call the paid work, what we call livelihood work. And then the third kind of value is care work. And care work is not tokenized, but it's measured by hours. And this is controversial. How do you measure something like care work? Well, it's a bit like the wages for housework movement. It's to visibilize something and to clarify conversations. We don't measure care work so that someone gets kicked out because they haven't been caring enough, but to actually have conversations with really visible allotments of this is what we've done, this is what we need to do. We're seeing that one person in particular is taking the brunt of this care work, but it factors into the economic calculations of the disco. And then the last thing is that they're primed for federation. There's this idea in the blockchain space of scaling of the world computer, which is something that is terrifying, of, how do we make it scale? And I have a big problem with scaling, because to me, scaling is the mentality of colonialism, meaning we take something that is small and we just make it bigger, and we don't care about the specific cultural context that may lie in its path. So instead of scaling, let's federate, let's replicate. And part of the disco framework is this thing called the Federation Protocol, which says that when you get to over 15 or 20 people in a disco node, you federate it. Because 15 to 20 is our Damba number, is what permits us to have intimate relationships and trust. And trust is kind of like the hot potato in the blockchain space. There's a lot of talk of trustless interactions and how, with the blockchain, we can do away with intermediaries and trust. But, being trustworthy is kind of cool, but you have to look at the scope. This gets back to this differentiation that I alluded to between the commons, small, more intimate, and commons-based peer production, like global systems usually deployed over the internet. And discos can be a way for small co-ops and commons initiatives to create economic counterpower. And here I will quote British ecologist David Fleming. And I think I've managed a way to use this quote in every single presentation that I've done in the last year and a half, but because it just works. So what he says is that large-scale problems do not require large-scale solutions. They require a lot of small-scale solutions within a large-scale framework. This, to me, is lots of commons that can interact with each other through a peer-to-peer framework, and in the case of co-ops, of distributed cooperatives, that would be discos. So, Elinor Ostrom, whom we've mentioned many times already, said that theory informs practice and practice informs theory. There's no hierarchy over here, there's a mutuality, much like this false dichotomy between immaterial and material, etc. But discos, they actually arose from a community of practice, the Guerrilla Media Collective / Guerrilla Translation. And within the collective, we started having conversations, how do we do this thing? So just to give you some background, Guerrilla Translation is both an activist collective and an agency. What we do is we publish stuff pro bono that's interesting, that speaks, P2P, the commons, feminism, etc., and we publish it on our blog. But we're also a translation agency. We have a market interface that actually allows us to create commons and to do our pro bono work. So the framework is based on the governance model that was developed over the 5 last years for Guerrilla Translation to see how it could work for other collectives, etc. And this is based on this concept of the pro bono, the love work, and the livelihood work. So say that, for example, David has written an article, which I really like, and I would like my friends to be able to read in Spanish, because I think that it's important material and I feel passionate about it. So I will approach David and I will say, hey, can we translate this thing? We're going to put it up in our blog. Okay, we talk about it. We do it. So just for the sake of this example, say that that's 1,000 words long. So we would tally that as 100 credits or 100 euros, whatever you want to think about. Okay, so that's done. But then next week, Benjamin comes over and says, "Oh, I have to translate something for the university." I said, "Okay, in that case, it's you asking us, not us offering, and you're coming from an institution, so you will interface with the agency, meaning we're a co-op, we will give you a quote to do this translation, okay? And the translation, what a coincidence, is 1,000 words long. So we do the translation, and that's 100 credits. The client, in this case, pays us 100 euros. But then out of those 100, we take 25, and we start paying down the other 100 that we put in pro bono. This is an extremely simplified version of the model. Pro bono work is measured, and agency work is measured, and 25% of the proceedings of the agency work goes to pay the pro bono work that has been done. So there's a bling, magic conversion, everyone gets paid at the end of the month. And we do this because we feel strongly that not everyone can afford to be an activist. And sometimes activism is a privilege based on availability and time. Oops. Hello. Does anyone know any good jokes? Anyway, can you hear me? Yeah, just the thing about activism again is if you're a single mother having to take care of 5 children, maybe you don't have 3 hours free to go to demonstrations or to create commons, etc. We created this system so people could ensure their social reproduction while creating commons. We're practicing economic sovereignty by taking what we get paid and putting it back. Thank you. But so far, we've only spoken about productive work. What about the reproductive work? Well, the care work is at the center. And it tempers the productive work to make sure that we're not leaving it behind. Oops. I'm going to have to show you the screen. So I'll give you an example of how we do this in Guerrilla Translation. We have a daily check-in where we ask 4 questions. Okay? And the first one is, what did you do yesterday? So you say, I worked on this, I did that, whatever. The second one is, how are you feeling today? And, you know, it's like, I have my period. I feel awful. I feel really good, but we know. The third one is, what blocks do you have? It's, well, this translation is driving me crazy, or there's actually this problem with my family. And the fourth one is, what are you doing with your well-being? And after you hear someone saying that they've been on this diet or doing meditation for 3 weeks, like, you become kind of curious. This is kind of like a cybernetic system. It works really well. We know when someone needs help. We know when someone is in trouble. We know where to direct our efforts with very little need for explicit coordination, just because we have this communication, just because we have this caretaking. We also have an assigned supporter. There's 2 kinds of support. There's mentoring. We have a 9-month mentoring process. So for example, normally in a co-op, you pay some social capital to get in the co-op. So access to a co-op is also based on privilege, up to a sense. In a disco, in a project like Guerrilla Translation, you actually train with us for 9 months, and you're doing pro bono work. But we're putting as much effort as we can in mentoring you, but also learning from you as you do. That's one type of care work. The other type is mutual support. Every person has what we call a mutual support buddy, holding their back. And these people usually have monthly calls. So for example, if in the daily check-in someone is feeling like shit, and you're taking care of that person, you're gonna go and talk to that person. But at the same time, someone else is taking care of you. There's always someone holding someone else's back. It's like, you know, like a conga line, but in a circle. So this model, the model developed originally in Guerrilla Translation, and now the Disco governance model, value tracks, commons-oriented pro bono work, ethical market livelihood work, and creative work for fair distribution of income. And all these ideas come together, again, to make a synthesis of these 4 influence, commons and P2P, open cooperativism, open value accounting, and feminist economics into a coherent framework, but also to rescue the baby from the bathwater of DAOs, of DAOs, of the decentralized autonomous organizations, because yes, they do offer some benefits. But as these technologies are being developed by the IBMs and HBSCs of the world, we need other narratives. We need other narratives that ensure that these other elements are present. Some more tidbits about discos, their balance in culture and structure. This is a dialectic that we have in the commons, which is it all about culture, is it all about conversation, or is it about legal forms? You need to be aware of the two. And they both reinforce each other, because culture without structure leads to the tyranny of structurelessness. Structure without culture leads to the mechanistic interactions which I'm trying to advocate against. They're inclusive, relatable, and educational. If you go to a disco, yes, you will understand what the blockchain is in your own terms, and you will help us through maybe your initial lack of understanding on how to communicate better. There's a pedagogical element built in. They're non-speculative. A lot of the stuff in the blockchain space is based on initial token of coin offerings, which is put some money into this cryptocurrency and you'll become a millionaire. This is quite stupid. This is actually based on real work and real value. And the tokenistic dimension is secondary. It's not based on that. They're multi-layered. With a federation protocol, we're not trying to create one great cooperative to rule them all and to have like branches in every country. It's like, this is what we came up with. These are the tools that we've developed. Please take them. Take them and do what you will with it, because we want you to. They're modular, but not prescriptive. There also, DLT stands for Distributed Ledger Technologies, and more broadly, blockchains. They're not exactly the same thing, but even though we can use blockchains and DLTs for discos, it doesn't depend on it. You can use tally sticks. You can use like marks on a chalkboard to keep track of value. You don't need to use one of these blockchain systems. Yes, it does help if we're using modular compatible systems, but do what you will. You don't have to use our tools if you're not comfortable with them. Oops. They also question the online versus offline dimension. And this is a quote that I took from Catalan and Mexican activist Guiomar Rovira. Online or offline, again, we have bodies. Everything is on live. So even though these are distributed organizations and a lot of the interactions take place over the internet, there are living people with emotions and with needs over here. Copy fair license. I'm not going to go into this, but this is a type of license which allows entities like co-ops to capitalize on cultural or creative works, but not corporations. So it's between like total copyleft that lets anyone make a profit out of the code or of the resources, and Creative Commons non-commercial, which stops commercial activity. And they're based in viable ethical business models, not white papers, like much of the blockchain stuff is. And they're also political, because if this came from an intersectional feminist, anti-capitalist collective, obviously, like the biases over here are political. And I think that all acts and all organizational forms are political, whether they choose to represent themselves or not. So after this primer on the distributed cooperative organization, I'd like to go back to the question that I posed in the beginning, which is, what is the future of work? And I'll give you my answer, and the answer that has arisen in discussions with my colleagues in Guerrilla Media Collective, and also my colleagues in the Commons movement. The future of work is restoration. Restoration of our relationship to our living planet and the non-human world. Restoration of our relationships with each other. And this is not work that can be automatized and put on a blockchain for higher efficiencies. It's not a society of leisure if we're not taking care of ourselves, if we're not taking care of our environment. And there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that we can do it through ways which are more ambitious and more commons-oriented, more feminist, than something like a Green New Deal. Positive as that may be, there's other ways. And discos they're not really an answer. Discos are a way to ask better questions. We have the two user communities, Guerrilla Media Collective and also Culture Stake with our partners at Furtherfield that you have showcased. But for example, like imagine a legal disco. So again, you're a lawyer, you do pro bono work, but you track that. But you also do work for the buffet, you get paid, that's also tracked. But suddenly, everyone's talking about care work in this group of 15 people in the local elective. Think about public provision of public services, something like the Preston or the Evergreen model being given to a series of discos, with also the advantages of having like other types of economic flows and exchanges available due to the underlying technology. And the important thing is what you do as an individual with your productive capacity, with the energy that you have before it turns into entropy, is what are you going to do with your life? What are you going to do with your time? And if we can find frameworks, and Disco is our offer, to do things that put the commons, that put life at the center, then I think that that is time well spent. The word commons, the etymology, it takes us back from the Norman to the Latin munis, which means gift and duty, gift and responsibility. Gift and responsibility, so think of that in relation to resources and relationships. How do we treat relationships? We turn them to services. How do we treat resources? We turn them to products. With the commons, we have a very different set of values. And again, Disco is our way to put the commons, specifically in the space of the blockchain, but also in the co-op space. And concretely, about the project, this has been going for a year, and there's two components. I talked about the thing about culture and structure. So the cultural component is the framework, which is predicated on care work and real-world prototypes, to make these movements, these technologies, these practices accessible to the precariat. And again, there's a high focus on accessibility, on handbooks. We want to do animations and stuff to make it, tangible, chewy. The Disco stack, this is like a lot of technological hoo-ha. Does anyone know what IPFS stands for? Yeah? Interplanetary File System. Anyway, these are the technologies, so I'll give you a layperson's explanation. Discos do not use blockchains as the default. Within a Disco, there is trust, so we track the economic value with something called activity pub, value flows, etc., which do not require blockchains or the huge energy consumption and the slowness that they incur. We have something, but then when we enter into like economic interactions with someone that we may just have met, that we haven't had the time to develop the trust, all that information gets compressed and then put in a public blockchain. But we're not using the blockchain all the time. We're using the blockchain just for when we had, so for example, if within the co-op we need to have a handshake, why do we need to put that in the blockchain? It's ridiculous. You don't want to make a system with a blockchain, in a collective that can fit in one room. But when we go outside of that room where we have to interact with other collectives and people, the blockchain validates in incorruptible ways the economic value flows that we've agreed to within the co-op. And that's it. There's more stuff coming up soon. You can check it out on my website or on Guerrilla. Out of the three collectives, Commons Transition, that's Commons Advocacy, P2P Foundation, Commons Theory, Guerrilla Translation, Commons Practice, which is, and we're developing this within Guerrilla Media Collective, which is a Cooperativa Andaluza sin ánimo de lucro, which is a particular cooperative form that it's actually very compatible with what we're doing. So thank you.